For people who don't know what Sophie's Choice is, are you going to give the synopsis, the movie synopsis?
Having never seen Sophie's Choice, I don't know. I know the scenario, but I don't know the actual movie. I think, is it Meryl Streep and she's somehow forced to choose as she's fleeing some war-torn something or other. She's forced to choose one of her children. She has 2 children and she can only take one of them with her. Something like that. I have no idea.
I feel like the term Sophie's Choice, you should not be allowed to use it unless, one, you've seen the movie, and 2, you can provide the synopsis of the movie, which I can do neither of.
Can you provide the synopsis? Okay.
I did, like I do with most movies before I watch them, read the plot on Wikipedia because I don't like to be surprised.
Oh my God.
I don't want to be surprised.
It's awful.
I'm a skip tenner, so I skip 10 through movies. I don't want to see you walking down a corridor. I just want to see you when you get to your destination, so I skip 10. But I do also read the plot on Wikipedia because, honestly, I don't want to be surprised.
I kind of think we have to cancel the podcast. I don't know how to be friends with a person like that. What are you doing?
Well, when was the last time? I got to go back as far as The Matrix to say I'm watching something that doesn't fall in the normal pattern. But if I'm watching a romantic movie, it follows a certain pattern, right? Boy meets girl.
Yeah, they're called tropes and they're great. Yeah.
Yeah, it's because of the trope that I don't need to be surprised. I can read and just be like, all right, cool. Is it interesting enough to watch? And I can save myself 90 minutes.
It depends. There's absolutely situations where someone doesn't do a trope very well. But the joy of the trope is you get to see...
The joy of the trope.
You get to see it through the joy of the trope. You get to see it through like the lens of these 2 characters.
I've got to assume you're not the first person in the world to say the joy of the trope. Let's see, the joy of the trope. No, you might be the first person in history to say those words.
In history to say that? That cannot possibly be true. I'm sure somewhere on AO3 is the joy of the trope.
Joy of the trope.
Welcome to Acceptance Criteria, where we talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of how software gets made and how we can all do a better job together. My name is Kevin Thomas Euland, and across the Zoom from me is Andrew Greener. Say hi, Andrew.
Hi, Andrew. We're also here to get deeper on the human elements. I could go on for an eternity about people and how they think about the process of building complex systems. And I can't think of 2 better people to do that than Kevin and I.
I can, but they're unavailable this week. On today's show, Andrew has a real Sophie's Choice situation with trying to build a software development team with just 3 people. How did you come up with this question?
Being a startup guy, I've been acquired, 5 times now? And I'm always interested I've been posed the question a couple of times when I've been talking to CTOs or CEOs hiring early stage startup where, okay, cool, we're bringing you in. Who are the first 3 hires, right? So it's an interview question I've been asked many times. If we bring you in, who's your next hire? Why is it important? All that kind of stuff. So I thought, as somebody a successful startup guy like yourself, I'm interested to get your thought process on who you bring in and what are even though there's a positive to a couple of these roles, I'm going to give you a little bit of flexibility on a couple of these roles, but I'm interested to see where you see downsides in that as well.
Okay. I think we'll have to put the caveat at the front to anybody in finance or a leadership position. This is not carte blanche to go and cut your teams down to 3 people. This is a thought experiment to explore the roles. And to your point, if you have to hire in priority order. But the last thing I need is to get blamed because we helped lay off 40% of a company's staff because they realized, I just need the enterprise architect and a product manager. But before we get to all of that, let's take a short break and we'll be right back. All right, welcome back. This is a segment we like to call Personas, where we talk about the types of roles you'll encounter in the software development world and how those folks work best and you can work with them more effectively. So it sounds like you want to talk about a number of roles.
Yeah, so I'm going to give you, here's your choice. You're allowed, it's a brand new company, no technical staff. You have an MVP, an idea, and here we go. So you're allowed to pick 3 roles on a high impact project. So it's big, it's enterprise. It's not just some 1-page web application.
Okay.
You get to pick the roles and explain why you selected them and then justify the exclusion of the others. Let me give you the roles that I'm going to give you the choices of. And if you have any new roles that you think that I should have added to the list, then we can talk through them as well. Okay, so the first one is an enterprise architect. This person can also code, but ultimately they think like an enterprise architect. architect. For our non-technical listeners or people who don't really understand the subtle definition of the role, this is going to be somebody who thinks about the bigger picture. So why is that important in a startup? Because it could potentially impact your speed, but then on the flip side, it could impact the quality of the architecture or the overall breadth of the thinking around what you're building.
So they think about the technical big picture, not the...
Yes.
Okay. And when you say it impacts your speed, is it going to make you faster or slower?
That's the perception. So oftentimes with an enterprise architect, the perception could be that the implementation will be slower, but that the implementation will be more thoughtful, fuller. And also let's agree that I'm making an assumption that these are all accomplished roles. The people that you are bringing in, they're accomplished. So you're not going to get an enterprise architect who's completely terrible and build you something that doesn't work. They're going to deliver you something that does work and has breadth of thought around, the broader picture of the technology. So that's role number one.
So I'm not disagreeing with you. I think we should just challenge and interrogate these roles.
Absolutely.
What about a good enterprise architect isn't slowing things down? Why is a good enterprise architect not getting in the way? How are they doing that?
So let's drop down a little level and assume the enterprise architect is also thinking about software architecture. So the patterns that they're implementing in the software, there's probably good object-oriented concepts, meaning there's strong reuse of the code, there's abstraction layers, they're writing the data layer once, so the data access layer is written once and it's efficient and it's easy. As the team grows beyond these few roles, new developers coming in, there's good documentation, it's fairly easy and understandable to read their code because of the abstraction and the software architecture rules that they're following. So a lot of those recipes would just be second nature to further development hires.
Okay. Setting aside my assumption that you're cheating by letting them also be an actual software engineer and who can write code. How often is that true? That's you. So this is me making fun of you for putting your thumb on the scale and making sure your role survives by being able to say, well, also I can write code. So you don't need the developer. How often is that true of enterprise architects that they can also write code? What's my likelihood to find that?
That's part of the dilemma because it's the balance then, right? And this is where the project can be longer in the beginning because the enterprise architect is spending 20 hours a week thinking about the big picture and sometimes, but they're thinking 2 years down the road, oh, well, this is where this goes, right? So maybe you're getting 20 hours of architecture thinking and 20 hours of coding. And so that's part of the challenge, right?
I don't know that you answered my question. If I were to get 100 resumes from enterprise architects,
Yep.
How many of those resumes would I look at them and say, oh, they could also write code?
If they've gone through the software path, because not all enterprise architects, you could be a NetOps, more of an integration specialist architect. But if you're talking about a software focused enterprise architect, I would say 80 to 90% of those guys can write code in one or more languages.
Okay.
I'm defending enterprise architects there, so.
No. That's
Don't let me down. Don't let me down, guys.
I'm not disagreeing. I'm just trying to clarify for the listeners and myself as we think through this little thought exercise of yours. So, next role.
So I'm going to give you a straight software engineer, a developer that is similar to the enterprise architect role, but you're more than likely getting more coding, but you're not necessarily getting that thought process around the enterprise architecture. Now, remember, this is Kevin's Sophie's choice. So this is also about how much confidence you have in yourself to steer that engineer and have them thinking about concepts that they might have to learn along the way, or you're filling that gap, right? We're not just talking about anybody here. This is like Kevin Hewland specifically, what I know about you and your confidence to be able to guide that developer into building something that's not going to be thrown away.
Okay. So in that situation, I have worked with software developers who are very good at thinking through half of what the enterprise architect would have thought about. So we're not hiring kids out of college. This is someone with some level of experience. Where in your mind does the typical software developer not reach through no fault of their own, just through expertise and experience that doesn't get to where an enterprise architect is?
I'm giving you a developer that has 7 years minimum experience.
Okay.
Has some knowledge of the cloud. And I say that lovingly for the cloud software engineers, knowing that infrastructure is probably something that they're familiar with. So a lot of engineers will think about code and scaling in code. And then some of the more modern engineers who have cloud experience will think about scaling in infrastructure as well as code. So knowing when to code, when to scale in the infrastructure. But at 7 years with that experience, there's still a little bit of guidance needed from a senior player. In this case, it's Kevin Hewland. So it's how much confident you are in saying, I can guide you, and then you have to take it the rest of the way. And 7 years, I think, think at 7 years, you've been through the API development, you've done data access. I think at 7 years, you're pretty refined.
Okay. So one of the roles I'll add to this list later, developers tend to specialize. So am I getting a full stack developer who's done, of the 7 years, they've done 2 or 3 in UI, 2 or 3 in APIs and database?
You never let me down. That's exactly what I was thinking. So you do have a full stack developer. They're going to be useful in the database, they're going to be useful in the user interface, and they're going to be useful in the business logic layer, the back end code. So I'm giving you a full stack engineer.
Okay. The trade-off being, I wouldn't necessarily expect my full stack engineer to write the most complex, crazy, recursive database processing code or a mobile app, right? So we are making a trade-off with that definition.
Absolutely. And again, this is about Kevin's experience and my experience. We'll get into it. It's like the types of engineers we've seen. And you're absolutely right. There's going to be a trade-off. There's going to be a level of longer term survival of that code that will definitely come back up again as we talk more through these roles. But yeah, so you got a full stack engineer there.
Okay. I'm looking at your notes. I'll be curious how some of the people listening to this who have either these job titles feel. Let's go to the next job title.
Scrum Masters are going to hate me and project managers are going to hate me for grouping them in together. But this is essentially somebody who can run the project. So I'm going to say it's a Scrum Master or project manager. And that's to also respect that not everywhere is agile, right? There are still project managers who run projects.
Sure.
And then we also have hybrid. So it could be that as we talk, you're like, I want somebody who's both for this reason. So I'm going to say Scrum Master or project manager, but then we can talk about the person who's the hybrid.
Okay. Makes sense.
Okay. The next position is a product manager. Could call it the visionary. So a product manager, you can ask me questions, but this is not my lack of respect for the product management position. But of all the positions I've got listed here, it is the most foreign to me because I've led a team of product designers, but from a product management position. And also the caveat here is that you are a product manager. So this might be one of those weighted things where it's like, well, I'm doing that myself. Is that a gimme where you're like, I don't need one, I got me. But that's the one that I can't speak to the true value in an early stage startup if there's already a Kevin Newland.
Well, I think that is the trick of this scenario you're putting in front of us is if you are a startup, then oftentimes those sort of co-founders, early CEOs, CTOs are providing that product management vision, which is both good and bad. And we can dig into that as we talk through this scenario.
Absolutely, because some of when I think of the startups that I've worked at, some of the challenges being the product visionary is also external and they're having meetings about growing the company and walking around with a pitch deck all over New York City trying to get investment and customers. And then the day-to-day product owner role, which you're probably not getting in your first 3 hires, should really fall in that product manager role. But how often are they disconnected? Okay.
And then we've talked about in the past the role of the product owner.
Yep.
And so I think like both of our experiences in the startup, you merge product owner and product manager a little bit, but I'm curious if there's a reason you have not included product owner.
No, and I will allow you to, again, treat that similar to the Scrum Master, project manager. You could have a product manager who is also a hybrid, who can do that product owner position.
All right.
The next role is quality assurance. And I'll give you a little bit of freedom here. This person could be a specialist in automation, could be an SDET, which is a software developer who specializes in testing frameworks. So it could be somebody who's a lot more technical than what you might think of a typical quality assurance engineer of the past. So this could also be an engineer who has software quality testing experience.
Okay.
The next role, database architect. And when I say can develop, I mean solely in the database stack. This is not somebody who's you would necessarily think is writing code, but then it becomes your decision as to whether, okay, here's some scenarios where I might let the database architect play multiple roles and it might influence the types of technology selection we have. We'll get into more detail, but that one's an interesting one to me because it starts to reach into some of the challenges I see with big companies today where data architects have really filled the role of software architect, certainly in data-driven companies. But yeah, we'll get into more detail, but that's a database architecture role.
Okay.
And the final one, I'm going to give you a little gift here. UX designer who can code. So the UX designer can take their designs and implement front end, but that's as far back as they can go.
Interesting. So I would say of my earlier question of 100 UX designer resumes that you got, how many would be able to code is definitely a smaller percentage.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would agree.
But I think that's one of the things that oftentimes UX skill sets get thought of as just wireframes, whereas I think a good UX person understands how to conduct user feedback interviews, understands how to do journey mapping, understands how to do persona development. And so even if this project was API only, I think UX oftentimes gets left out of that conversation, and they shouldn't. That's a skill set that is beneficial even when there are no UI wireframes. And, how do you make the button look shiny and clickable? That's something that can happen. That UX skill set is helpful even when it doesn't have that front end requirement.
One of the other things I'd be interested in here too is, does your list, and we can get to this at the end, but does your list change based on B2C versus B2B? And we could talk a little bit for our users about the difference there, because I think it was something early in my career that I struggled with. This is always about experience. You could go read about it, but it doesn't really replace the experience of sitting in meetings with people who've worked in B2B versus B2C. But we can get a little bit into the detail of the differences in a B2C space versus a B2B space. So they would be your choices for your technology team. And I think probably best is if you reorder, take a moment to reorder, and then we can start to fight about who's right and who's wrong.
So as I look through this list, so enterprise architect can develop. Developer is clearly developing. Database architect is only developing in the DB. UX designer is unlikely, but possibly developing in the front end. So it feels like I have to put developer first because I need code to be written. Don't just shake your head at me. Talk. This is an audio format, not a visual format.
Yeah, my brain's trying to find words to express
I'm talking through it. I'm trying to figure it out.
Okay, so developers first.
So, I mean, and this is the thing that I think is the real challenge with this. And I think we're both kind of cheating here, right? Because if you're somebody listening who's in a similar situation, but you're not me, you don't have that product manager background and you don't have that, that natural skill set. I won't say natural, that developed skill set. I think we brought up some good points around, if you are the co-founder who has that product vision, even if you do, you are, to your point, so external facing. You are the one who's also working on the business plan and selling it to people and raising money and doing all of these external things, that just because you have the product manager skill set or even product owner skill set doesn't mean you're providing that benefit to the people you're working with. I also think one of the things I've definitely run into as the co-founder who was providing that product manager, the vision and the requirements and all of that, I was too close to the idea. It was my idea. It was my company. It was my baby. I thought it was a good idea. Clearly, I was going out and trying to raise money and start this company, but that doesn't mean all of my assumptions and requirements were good. And there was no one there to challenge those because I didn't have a person whose only job was to look with a clear eye at the requirements and at the market and at the personas and users and figure out what we actually want to do. And so as a co-founder, relying on your own skill set to provide that product management infrastructure, that's possibly a gap that you're going to not realize you have.
Yeah, let me talk through a little bit of my thinking with the developer versus the enterprise architect who can develop.
Sure.
But both positives and negatives for both of them. With the developer, I'm more than likely up and running very, very quick. I'm getting code. At that stage of the business, it's probably beneficial because while you're gallivanting in New York trying to sell this vision, I'm probably getting a POC fairly quickly. With the enterprise architect, I might be thinking like it's maybe going to be a little bit of time because they're assessing and they're designing and they're looking at infrastructure and relationships with third parties to build an ecosystem that scales. Some of the other interesting parts of the two roles are going to be what, as a former startup owner, what's the value in selling a company that is 90% third party infrastructure versus 80% of its code, right? Is there a value in having developers write code because that is the intellectual property that you're selling versus, well, all you're selling me is design patterns in the cloud and some data that you've acquired? That would be the kind of thing I'd be asking you, like as somebody who's sold a company, do you feel there's a difference between the two?
It depends. I think this is the perennial trade-off choice that no team has ever found the 100% correct balance between, because the alternative is if I know Snowflake provides me a data hygiene capability, but it's only 70% of what I was hoping to deliver to customers, but that's 70% code I now don't need to write, and I now can go and write the other things all around that I want to get the benefit out of, then that's possibly a valid trade-off, especially for the MVP. So being able to go and say, our secret sauce is the things we know how to do once we get the data into the system. We do have that unfortunate first step. We got to get the data into the system. We're leveraging Snowflake's ability to do that for us. Then that story is better, actually, because we're getting to our value faster, even though the amount of IP we've written is less.
Let me ask you a difficult question. This is a difficult question because it's, yeah, it could be controversial, right? But you can sell your company for 100 million, whether there's a developer or an enterprise architect as the first hire, laying down the infrastructure and architecture. Your company will sell for $100 million either way. But when the acquiring company tries to scale that platform 2 years later, it's more expensive to do it with the developer version. There's no recourse for you. You get your 100 million, you walk away. Is there a conscientious thought process to what you're actually selling and handing over?
I mean, the real answer is no. No one ever makes that trade-off. Of course you should. I think you have to do that to enough of a degree. You won't pass the acquisition due diligence, won't pass if you don't have some of that. But I think the likelihood that you, especially as a startup, took the time to truly do the enterprise architect version depends on how long you are sticking around. By the time you showed up with me, you started to make changes and force us to do things differently, and that was good. But we'd been around for 3 years at that point and had a bunch of the stuff built in that we weren't ever going to be able to undo, versus I think the point you're trying to make here is, had that enterprise architect been there from day one, not all, but some of the earlier decisions would have been made differently and therefore set you up for that success. But I also think that's entirely dependent on the acquisition, the things that company who's acquiring you is looking for. It's so context dependent. If you're coming in, so you and I have been in a situation where we came in and we were the new foundation of a very complex series of integrations between 4 other companies that company had previously acquired. And we benefited from the fact that you forced us to do some things and get us ready to do it differently. Had we simply been the crown jewel who was simply arriving to give that company a better market position and acquisition, I don't think they would have cared. The due diligence would not have dug into that level. So the problem is, me as a startup person on day one, I can't anticipate who's going to acquire me 5 years later. And so my ability to make that trade-off decision, it's 50-50.
Yeah, and to be clear, actually, this is not based on our previous experience together. What we built and sold was actually way ahead of its time from a scaling perspective.
Right.
So this is more of a question that either one of us might not have experienced in the past. I like to think as an enterprise architect, well, I shouldn't say I like to think of it, but I know part of the challenge of being an enterprise architect can sometimes be letting go of the future and saying,
Right.
well, we have to win today, and that's going to give us more of a leash. It's going to give us more of an investment. Let's make some revenue, and then we can do things right. So it's almost like you're accepting that technical debt, which is a whole series of other conversations, right, that we can get into.
But then I think that's where this question is so dependent. Are you Andrew the co-founder, Kevin the co-founder, or someone else the co-founder? My skill set is knowing that I think 20% like you do, and like a product manager and like an engineer. And so my confidence level in coaching that developer who I've put in the first hire position is higher than it might be for someone else. So if you are a product manager who has this really good idea for a company and you've got a friend who's an engineer and you two are going to go start something up, if you don't have the confidence in your own skill set, then the two of you might be you should bring in an enterprise architect first, because you don't know that you're going to be able to coach the person that you would hire, and you need them to bring that skill set themselves.
Yeah, I love this. And this is why I brought up the Sophie's choice of these 3 roles for our listeners. What Kevin's talking about right now is fundamental. It has to be based to some extent on your experience level and the places and the gaps that you can actually fill and make up. So I love this because it changes. The list can be,
right,
well, I'm extremely technical and I have a business side. The enterprise architecture role, I can fill that, right? So I love that you bring that up. Okay, so you got developer at number 1. Who's now at number 2 then?
I'm going back and forth between it. Well, again, so this is where it's going to depend on what we're building. So if I'm building, to sort of contradict myself from my earlier statement, if we're building a purely back-end thing, I'm not devaluing the value UX brings to all software projects, but I will, for this purpose, say if it's a front-end thing, depending if we're building a mobile app, if we're building maybe this gets into our B2B versus B2C. If we're building a B2C solution, which today basically means it has to have a mobile component, different. I would look for the UX designer who can code a little bit of the front end, I think. And that's a different answer than if we were doing B2B.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so let's go the B2C route first. So you're bringing in the UX designer second.
Because you're going to succeed or fail on that early adoption. And you don't have, and this is where it gets really tricky. In a B2B scenario, most likely, the reason you think you can be successful in B2B is because you have some kind of you have some kind of contacts. You were a salesperson, you were a product manager, you think you have customer relationships, you think you can reach out to people and find your 3 beta customers on your MVP. And the level of expectation in B2B startups is just fundamentally different. You can get away with the relationships you've built and the value you're providing to somebody, and your UX experience shouldn't suffer, but it does not need to hit it out of the park in the way that a B2C scenario needs to deliver for those people immediately. You don't get a second chance. You don't have a relationship with those consumers. They try your app, they try your website. If it doesn't work for them, they just turn it off and they don't ever come back.
So why is it not? Let's pretend this B2C application is one of many. There's many being on the there's many versions of this application out in the market.
Why are you starting a startup and think you can compete in that situation?
Just because confidence, it's like I'm just supremely confident.
Okay.
Can I not just go steal the UX design from the 3 best apps?
This is where, this entire topic is so subjective. What is your secret sauce that you're bringing, and why are you different, and why would that UX design not need to change as a result of whatever special thing that you're doing? But yes, that's so much easier on the B2B side too, right? On the B2B side, if you're in a space that has even 1 or 2 competitors, you have a template that you can go and I'm not advocating that you go and steal what the competition does, but if your goal is to go and sell somebody and say, hey, come use my competing solution, familiarity is a valuable thing, actually. Showing them that, you used to call this thing a campaign, but Kevin's cool new app calls it the launch platform. Like, no, they don't know what a launch platform is. Call it a campaign. Have it have the things that they're used to so that they can get the benefit of the cool new thing that you're doing. Consumer apps, I don't know if that's true that way.
And you're certainly right. On a B2B application, where potentially, if it's an internal focused application within your own business, then UX design, as we've often seen, right? That's something that...
Which it shouldn't be, by the way. Like, you should go and raise $5 million and freaking hire some UX people. But you're making me do this horrible Sophie's Choice scenario. So in B2B, I might be cutting my UX person out of the top 3.
I'm not going to say who I think your third choice is, but I think I know who your third choice is. I'm not happy about it, but I think I know who your third choice is.
It really depends.
Okay, we're just going with regular B2C. You're competing in a market that's not brand new. Your secret sauce is shared by those competitors that you're going up against. It's just the market is big enough for you to compete in. And I think I know. Oh, I might be wrong here.
Ooh, are you wrong? Who did you think it was going to be?
I thought you were going with the classic 3-tier sort of engineering team of, I've got my back-end developer, I've got a UX designer who can do the front end. And I actually thought you were going to go with the database architect, knowing that.
Interesting.
So it's interesting that you didn't.
So if I'm in B2C, so this is Kevin putting his team together. I never would. I don't think I would ever try. I tried B2C once. It was so hard. It was just not my skill set. So if I am B2C, I think I need a product manager or owner who knows how to deal with that, knows how to go and figure out, we're going to have to do a level of A/B testing of functionality to see how users respond, focus groups, things that that's not my skill set.
Wow. And if I was to boil this all down to a score, I think you went from an 8 out of 10 to a 5 out of 10 on my I'm joking, of course, because it's super fluid and dynamic based on the scenario. But I genuinely thought you would go with the database architect and give yourself that 3-tier.
See, but again, so this is the thing, is it's so subjective to what you're working on, because I don't tend to think of, in a consumer scenario, I'm not saying data isn't important, and I'm not saying that whatever you're building in this world might be incredibly data intensive, but I almost think that the cloud has kind of helped people not have to worry about that on day one. There's so much infrastructure that a cloud environment just can provide to me. I'm not worried about my MongoDB having to scale correctly. That's just built into the cloud service for me. So can I sort of let that be the 4th or 5th hire?
I love that you brought up MongoDB. And not because MongoDB has any challenges, but some of my past may have involved working with teams where I got there and there wasn't a database architect or a database developer or a database data centric engineer. And Mongo, technologies like Mongo, Elasticsearch, I always joke they'll accept anything. The minute you get your connection and you start writing data, it's going to accept it. It's very forgiving.
It's that problem we were talking about with the British Post Office, where they were just allowed to write whatever data they wanted to.
Yeah, and then you start to get some really interesting. So it's almost like this schemaless design, and you get two engineers with completely different, even different standards around their column names, right? And we've all done sort of fluid dynamic things with data where we're like, hey, let's prefix this column with this value and blah blah blah. So that's interesting. Product manager and owner hybrid, interesting.
All right, so we have been talking B2C though, which is not my forte.
Okay, let's.
If we were to switch to B2B,
as we start to get feedback on the blog and the podcast from data architects, I'm actually feeling more for the data architects than I am from for the enterprise architects here, right? Like I would love to hear from the data architects here as to your feeling of not being there.
Yeah, tell me your horrible consumer apps scenarios where you came in late and they hadn't planned for the data scaling and data contracts and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, that'd be super interesting. Yeah, that's just not my experience.
I would love to hear from those guys.
All right, so if we're going B2B, I mean, the problem is, actually, I would almost argue against myself, which is consumer apps are harder to scale. And so, if anything, maybe my answer should have been enterprise architect instead of developer, because the enterprise architect is going to figure out some of that foundational stuff to scale against. But again, this is who's my co-founder? What am I don't know. This is such a hard question.
Sorry, so where would you put the enterprise architect? Who would drop out potentially in that case?
Developer. So in a B2C scenario where you're worried about scale, then maybe an enterprise architect is the better solution than developer, because
you talked yourself out of the developer. Interesting.
But I feel like you're cheating. Your assumption that we're going to get 80 to 90% of enterprise architects who are going to write good code, it's probably not low, but I'm worried that that's high. Anyway, my resume search is harder now.
Yeah, I love that the enterprise architect came back up though. Even if I reduce the enterprise architects to half and half, where 50% can develop, I can tell you this: I wouldn't be taking an enterprise architect that couldn't code in my first three.
No, correct, exactly right. That's the problem, right? Is it has to be somebody who's contributing to the code base.
It has to be great architecture, fantastic, cool. Now I gotta hire somebody to come in and code it.
But I need those Lambda functions to actually run.
Yeah.
All right. So if I'm B2B, I'm worried about scale in another direction, which is just B2B tends to be massive data sets, massive volumes of things, not in terms of, so on the B2C side, I'm worried about number of users, number of interactions with small little data points. With B2B, I'm worried about even in your mid-size, again, what market are you going after? Are you going after small business? Are you going after mid-tier? Are you going after enterprise? The reality of today's situation is, aside from SMB, mid-size companies and enterprise companies can often have the same volume of data concerns. And so I am worried about building infrastructure that can't account for that. And I'm less concerned about, sorry to my UX friends, I'm less concerned about the UX of the B2B, especially because I likely have relationships that I am using in those early days. And so we can all just agree that the UI is going to get better in version 2, but we're doing the MVP just to get you the value of the really cool secret sauce that we have that we want you to buy from us.
You heard that here, UX designers. You heard it first here.
Mea culpa.
He just gone.
Absolutely
gone.
Pushed you to hire number 4.
Okay, so
I do wonder if I can get an enterprise architect who codes.
I feel so much better about your B2B list. So we got an enterprise architect at number 1.
The database architect only being able to code in the DB is a blocker. It's a reality, but I'm struggling. An important part of these early days is getting to value as quickly as you can. I sound like a horrible, weird buzzword guy, but I want as much code as quickly as possible so I get to people using it, and I get feedback, I get revenue, I get so much from having code.
I love that quote. I get so much from having code. That's where my list would completely change, because not that I see the death of code, but there are so many frameworks, certainly in the cloud these days, there are so many frameworks where the code has been abstracted. Take things like Flink or Arrow, Apache NiFi, and I think to myself, well, yeah, cool. Like, I need somebody to go write the Python, but the framework is there. So yeah, to me, I look at that database architect role, and I don't know why I feel compelled to defend it more than I would the enterprise architect role, but I think the database architect role is potentially in both my lists.
Yeah, that's what I'm leaning towards. Is I'm worried that they can only contribute to the DB layer, and the front end and services are so equally important. But most of my B2B scenarios are very data intensive, and you don't want that foundation to be wrong.
Yeah, because remember the database architect is data. It's the data flow as well, right? It's not just the database anymore. It's also
It's the governance, it's the
the
security,
governance,
it's
security, absolutely is, and certainly with today's regulations, we can throw that on the database architect, and we know we're going to get something.
Mhm.
PI, hey, you're sharing our PI with a third party. I'm expecting the database architect is going to have some of that thinking.
My third role. So the problem is, in a Kevin Euland startup, I can write front end code pretty well. Now, to the point earlier, I'm also out there doing too much selling and money raising and all of that kind of stuff. So how much time am I going to really have to that? But I also probably own 30% of this company. I'm not going to mind working the 60 hours and put in some extra time writing the front end,
Okay, so
which is bad. That's bad. I'm going to burn out.
I can give you a little bit of a cheat code here then. Would you be willing to get a hire that is the external version of Kevin Newland that's not on the list, which is I would be happy for somebody else to be gallivanting around New York selling my vision so that I can focus internally. Now, again, it's based on Kevin Newland experience, so it's going to be different for everybody. But
Right.
would you be happy to let go of the vision?
No.
Oh boy, so that should influence your third pick then.
Yeah. See, but the problem I have is I was trying to leave room because I think especially depending on who you are, so who are you selling this B2B solution to? If it's to the enterprise or even to the mid-market,
Fujitsu is
they desperately need help. That's a joke for anyone who hasn't listened to the episode about the UK post office scandal. The QA, the quality assurance, you die instantly if you release something that is too buggy to a B2B audience. If you're going after B2C and you haven't done the best QA, and every third time a consumer goes to do something, they can't upload it, in theory, your volume has cushion for those scenarios in a way that you don't in B2B. You've written a contract with a company to provide them a service, and their 17 users are going to log in and start doing that. Now, likely it's not 17 users in the beta period. You have some window here, but the quality of that code needs to be at such a level that you don't have constant fires that you need to put out in a way that I don't think is true in B2C. So it's why I wonder that QA needs to be up there, but I'm also balancing that I know I can fill in the gap that I don't have in this situation. If I don't have me, I kind of think developer has to be my third. Just because, I need more code. I get what you're saying about code being provided everywhere and that being less important, but I don't know that enterprise architect and database architect are providing enough for you for that to be true, unless you're going to go full low code, no code. Your B2B app is so straightforward. It is data entry and then a massive, really impressive custom proprietary thing happens in the back end. Then sure, if my front end can be low code, no code, and I can build that on top of what's Microsoft's powered low code, no code solution called? Anyway.
Power Apps.
Power Apps, there you go. If I can build a Power App on top of it and that gives me really basic infrastructure for a B2B user just to get the benefit of this really cool stuff that I'm doing with their database in a workflow on the back end, then maybe I can get without that. I don't know. This is a really hard one.
Well, actually, it's interesting though, because we've done this in the past together, right? Where we didn't have that budget for a big QA team. And remember, this is just your technical team, right? Let's assume there's also a few professional service engineers sitting around who are going to be fielding support and calls and some custom solutions inside the platform. We've repurposed those guys in the past, right, to do quality assurance.
Oh, yeah, we fully cheated and made them a QA team. Yeah.
And we had incentives for them doing that, which made it interesting
Yep.
and exciting, and they were fantastic at it, right? We had great success, and actually when they wore their QA caps, we had a bigger team of QA engineers than we could have ever afforded at that time, right? So
Right.
they did an amazing job. So I'm going to give you a little bit of room there to say there are 3 or 4 other people in the company who could potentially fill that role of QA.
Sure.
So does that influence you then enough to say, perfect, then I want my developer?
Well, then my next question is, again, depending on where you live, are you building this solution for a very specific type of enterprise or mid-market? What's the applicability of this? How many vendors and partners is your enterprise architect suggesting that you use? I'm wondering that the complexity of those scenarios means you need the scrum master or the project manager actually next,
Okay,
because
interesting.
that is a level of coordination that I don't know that your enterprise and database architects innately have. And so now the fact that you have 4 different subsystems that you're contracting through your cloud provider and licensing directly into the whatever, and that level of complexity and your backlog and dependency tracking and all of the things that go into that, even if you're agile, that still gets pretty hard. And so I'm wondering that Scrum Master or Project Manager should be my third hire here.
Interesting. So let's go with that then. So you right now in the B2B scenario, you have an enterprise architect, the data architect. You are going to fulfill, you're going to work extra hours and you're going to be the UX, UI developer.
Yep, I'm cheating
Designer
there.
and developer. You're cheating there,
Yep.
which is fine. It's based on you, so that's fine. And then your third hire is going to be the Scrum Master hybrid, probably with project management.
Maybe. It's so dependent on what I'm trying to go and do. That would not be my answer at the company you and I were at.
Okay, so who would change in that scenario of the company that you and I were at together?
Product manager. I'd make the last one product manager. Again, because maybe this is why I'm so dependent on my own experience. I needed people to challenge so many of my assumptions. We made so many assumptions in the first 2 to 3 years that had anyone else come in and had a fresh eye, had they worked at competitors, had they just simply been in the market, they'd have looked at some of those things that we thought were providing value and vision to the company and said, no, that's a distraction. You shouldn't have done that. And we were all too close to be providing the vision for this company and needed somebody to come in and have the ability to talk to personas, talk to clients, talk to prospects, and realize the true value we were giving to people.
Yeah, that's why I like this exercise actually, because I think it's good for our listeners. They probably understand as much about you as they are about these fictitious companies that we're building right now. It's who is Kevin Newland? What is his history? Where's his confidence level in his own abilities? So I think that's good, because I think it'll also help the listeners start to think about, well, what am I like? And I've been there myself. Like, I've been thinking about building a startup for 25 years now, before I even got into any of this. And I think to myself, what are the things that I can't do that have scared me off? Where I've been like, well, I can't do that, so I can't go create a startup. I got to go find this person who can do this for me before I even think about building my own startup.
Sure.
And I think a lot of people will be thinking about that as they're listening, is what kind of person am I?
So what would you have been? Did you agree with enterprise architect and database architect? What would your third have been?
I did, because I think on the third one, is it Kevin Newland or Andrew Greener?
It's Andrew Greener.
If I'm running it, I think I'm going with a product manager on the third role. And that's probably what you had said, but on steroids, right? It's that
sure, right.
I just don't have the same product management background as you. And so I would really be looking for someone. And I've been in a situation at a startup where we were getting the features from the business users internally, and it was all over the place. And quite often for the technology team who didn't have that business experience, sometimes they couldn't recognize when they were being asked for the same things in 2 different ways from the business owner. And it only when a product manager came in did you start to see a reshaping, which is this. Yeah, don't even do this, because in 1 year, the regulations, you're not even going to be able to do that, right? So I think for me, that product management role lays the blueprint, feeds the roadmap, then the tech is building the roadmap, right? So for me, yeah, product.
That makes sense. I think the other thing that's really tricky about this is, my real answer to this is just hire Kevin Newland and Andrew Greener, who are going to do like all 6 of these roles to varying degrees. And that's actually a bad answer, right? I got burned out doing this one time because I was doing 4 of the roles and I shouldn't have been, right? And so I think my natural inclination to be like, well, sure, but actually what you want is find a technical product manager who used to be a front-end engineer. And now you have 30% of a front-end engineer and 70% of a product manager. And in a startup, that doesn't everyone wear multiple hats? And it'll be great because that person's coding. Yes, but also no.
Well, also think about how many times does an individual set up to they start coding their own new startup, and how long before they start to hit some of these roadblocks where do they even recognize, like, well, I'm hitting this because, for a technical guy, it's obvious, like, hey, I don't have the data experience. That's my roadblock. But what about the person who's like, I'm just at a stalemate. I don't know what to code anymore. How many engineers who thought, well, I can code, I can build a startup.
Right.
How many of them got stuck on the product management role where it was like, well, I don't know enough about the business.
Right.
I just just don't, right? Yeah, I agree with you. A lot of people, this is the burnout, right? They try to do multiple versions of the multiple hats in these companies.
All right, so of the 7 roles, 6 of them made it to our lists for B2C and B2B. Apologies to QA. Andrew gave me a cheat, and I could use a bunch of people who aren't QA people to do some basic QA. But that's, again, because Kevin and Andrew are very good at getting people motivated and doing things. That's not necessarily a skill set you have. So your list might be different.
Absolutely. I would say, I would apologize as well and say, hey, QA, it feels like we're diminishing the role. We're actually not. We're working in a very set criteria here, which is early stage startup. I did give Kevin the cheat code here for business users. But for our listeners, maybe these are the types of patterns that you need to be thinking about is if I have professional service engineers sitting around, can I repurpose them? Right? What are the many hats that you have to wear in a startup? And then what are the incentives you can give people? We had done things like, was it bucks for bugs in the past?
Yep.
That one didn't go down well with the engineers, but the professional service guys love that.
Yeah. Listen, you got to get creative when there's only so many people and so many hours in the day.
Yeah, I love this. I love that the enterprise architect made it on a B2B. I could not agree with you more. I like I say, I've said it multiple times on the cast already. Database architect. I think the last 10 years of my career, I've spent a lot of time in data architecture, and I think maybe I'm a little tainted, biased, because so many of the problems in the big companies, medium-sized companies, started in the small companies, and it was the foundation that was not laid at the data architecture or the way the foundation was laid. So super representative of the data architect today. But yeah, be interesting to hear from those guys who weren't included in the B2C on Kevin's list. So I'd love to hear from those guys.
All right, well, if you are in one of those roles and want to sound off on where you ended up, come join the discussion about this episode on Reddit. And that's going to do it for us on this episode of Acceptance Criteria. If you like what you heard, maybe go and drop 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and leave us a nice review. And if you didn't like what you heard, remember the name of the podcast is Triple Click. Also, tell your friends if you like the show and that they should check it out. Some of the best podcasts out there grow by word of mouth, and we'd much appreciate it. And a friendly reminder that we are always interested in hearing questions directly from you, our listeners, for our segment User Stories. If you've got a scenario you'd like help with, whether it's working with an engineering or product team member, trying to figure out how to solve an agile process problem, or you just can't understand why your favorite app just updated everything and it's now terrible, we're here to talk it through with you. You can send those questions to acceptancepod@gmail.com, and we might be able to help on a future episode. And we're happy to keep it anonymous so no one can trace it back to you if you end up talking a coworker or something. To read articles that we've written on similar topics to the ones we talk about here, head over to the blog at acceptancepod.com. You can also follow us on most apps. We're at AcceptancePod. We'll post links to show notes and any articles from the blog there. We're also building a community on Reddit at r/acceptancecriteria, and I promise we'll be moderating the crap out of it to keep it a nice little slice of the internet. For now, I'm Kevin Thomas Euland, and you can find me on most apps at ktomasuland. That's ULLAND.
And I'm Andrew Greener, and you can find me on most apps at Criteria Greener. That's GREINER. And this has been Acceptance Criteria. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to hearing from you.